Welcome to a very brutal pro-revenge story from Destruction Escapist, where OP's employer refuses to pay for the equipment OP had lent the company. In response, OP, a programmer, remotely destroys all digital assets of the company and bring the owner to knees. My employer stole my stuff, so I made him pay for it. I hope this won't backfire, but I believe I did not break any law, so here it goes. Sorry for the long post. Some background first. Since I was a kid, I was fascinated in computers and electronics. During school, I had no social life. I just stayed at home and was learning stuff. I was going to generic high school that should prepare you for university without any specialization. But there were few people with same interests as me, and our IT teacher was really supportive of us. When I finished high school, I already had a job as a programmer and had a few years of experience in the field. I also was experienced with electronics, and even worked on a few contracts for the factory in town, involving creating machines for them. Other engineers came up with an idea how the machine will work. My job was to put their motors, sensor, wire it up, and write program for the PLC to control it. I moved to a big city and started university, so I lost my programming job in my city. I was going looking for a part-time job, while living of my parents' support. Things changed when my friend got an escape game voucher for 5 people for his birthday and took me with him. The escape game had cool magic stuff, like you placed objects in a shelf and all pictures in the room fall off the walls, etc. While we were there to solve puzzles, I was mostly interested in these magic things, making theories about how they made them and thinking how I would do it. When the game was over, I saw for a moment their technical room, and at this point I was like, I want to work here. I sent them my CV, and as I was overqualified for this job, I was accepted after first interview. I was young, naive, and stupid, so they just used me. My hourly rate was after tax as equivalent of $8.50. To put it in comparison, cashier at big store here makes roughly $6.50 plus benefits. First few months were awesome. I was paid for doing my hobby, and the owner loved me, as his previous tech guy, referred to as tech moron now on, was, compared to me, just dumb. I'm not bragging, I swear. He did not come up with almost any original design. He just found something on the internet and was skilled enough to read the schematics and somewhat copy it. But he had big gaps in his knowledge. Once he told me that I can't build a battery-operated circuit that will be powered while the battery is charging, as this would cause the battery to explode. When I told them about charging regulators and how it's not an issue with his phone or laptop, he just told me I was hired to help him and to f*** off. Over the time, Tech Moron started to realize that I'm just smarter than him, and his ego could not handle it. So he decided his only now from now on is to make my life a hell. For example, the owner tasked me with replicating device that they already have in one game, as he wanted to put it into another one. I spent week just by messaging Tech Moron, asking him for the schematics and source code, calling him, and he just never replied. Then I decided to f*** him. I came up with an improved design and built it. When I was shoving it at the next meeting to the owner, who was very happy with it, Tech Moron just yelled at me for not using his design and wasting time on reinventing wheel. After some time, the owner realized what was going on and hired another tech guy, Tech Senior from now on, but he cannot fire Tech Moron, as he had all important source codes and designs at his laptop, and because of bad contract, it was not property of the escape game company. Little did we know that in the future, he will not hand over most of the designs and codes, and we will end up rewriting that from scratch. The company was also franchising. We just took a game we already had running, made an exact copy, and installed it in another location. We then provided support, while they were paying us license fees, usually a small percentage of their profits. The owner was a typical manager who thought 9 women can deliver a baby in a month, and it showed as the company grew. Eventually, Tech Senior was made my boss, as he had much more experience in electronics, while I was more oriented on programming and on-site support for game masters if something broke. We didn't give a fuck about Tech Moron, as at this point, he just showed up once a month, did almost no work, criticized all we already did, and had working and went home. Things were going really well, so we hired few electronics student to help us. The building department, which was making props, like special wooden table that we could hide our magic into, also grew. Things were looking really good, until one meeting about new franchise client. The owner told us what he needs. We, tech guys, talked to props guys, went over all the requirements, and told him we need 10 weeks for it. Well, 8, but we always accounted for going sideways, as this date will be on the contract. Usual stuff in healthy company. Next week, next meeting. He told us that the client does not want to wait, and he put 5 weeks in the contract. His reasoning was, we are doing the same stuff as before, and now have more people, so it will go faster. We worked hard, like really hard. There were weeks when I just went home for 8 hours to take shower and sleep for a bit, then went back to the workshop to work on stuff. It was hard, but we managed to finish in time, and I got some sweet money in overtime. But this was a mistake. Now we showed him that what he wants is possible, so the next contract went over the exact same deadline. More overtime. I remember having almost no social life, just working the whole week, sometimes sleeping at the workshop, and being stressed as f. Then, every Friday I just went to a pub with a few friends, totally wasted myself to relieve the stress, and slept through the whole weekend. Then comes a Monday and we start over. Eventually I went from I love this job to I don't give a f, and I wasn't the only one. Our performance dropped and we started missing deadlines. Did the owner account for it in the contracts? No. Repetition makes perfection. This time you can do it faster, was his reasoning. And he just kept signing more and more contracts, dumping the shit on us. I remember the one meeting when he asked us about status of Project D as the deadline was next week. Well, we did not even start working on this, as we had our hands full with Project C, which was started later because we did not finish Projects A and B in time. This is how far it went. Deposits from new contracts were used to pay fines for old contracts. At this meeting, I realized I just have enough. Of course, our job was not only franchising. We had our own games that needed to be maintained, and we were doing that all the time alongside that franchising hell. What was the biggest issue with all games was the control software. It was a shitload of simple-purpose scripts driving all the Raspberry Pis and Arduinos in the game. But it had one UI presented to the game master, so he could control all the props in-game, override them, etc., at least in theory. But oh boy, it was buggy like hell. Sometimes not working at all. Sometimes you wanted to shine light on object, to give the players a hint, but instead it opened doors to the next level, etc. It was no universal, simple requests, required massive changes. Lots of overrides were not implemented correctly. One day, the owner finally agreed to my demands and allowed me to rewrite all of that. It took me few months, but I created Universal Engine that could handle all the game designers were asking us to do, was easy to expand, had error protection and recovery tasks. Now, if one prop stopped responding, you just opened the debug page and clicked restart. This was a game changer, as previously the game master had to switch off the power, and sometimes that was not possible during the game. And my biggest achievement, I created easy scripting language which was used to describe the game workflow. The game master now had a load of working, controls, and option to interrupt predefined tasks and change the flow. But that barely happened, as the game was now almost automatic and he was there just to give hints. I was not comfortable running this software on the Raspberry Pi that was there for the previous control, and I wanted a better hardware for that. My request was always denied by the owner, but the games manager wanted the new software working ASAP. To this point, we were always just testing it from my laptop. So I decided to lend them few PC. Some time ago, friend from a big corporate pulled a load of Dell Optiplex workstations from eScrap. They were working fine, had Intel i5 CPU, 8 gigs of RAM, decent onboard graphics, DisplayPort, USB 3.0, fully working computer. You could buy them refurbished for about $200. The company just had no use for them, and nobody wanted to go over selling them, so they just dumped them. I had a stack of 20 of them at home, just collecting dust. I took few of them to my work, and the boss agreed we will settle it later, so I just emailed him list of all of my HW that was used in the games. 5 PCs, some Wi-Fi routers, old tables, some monitors, and other stuff I had collected mostly from e-waste, fixed it, and had no use for it. Of course I did not tell them I got that for free, and was expecting them to pay me for it. Fast forward, I was fed up with the franchising deadlines and got few job offers that made me realize my real price, and that I was abused young kid in his 20s, working for almost nothing. But I was waiting. In the next month, my software was deployed in the remaining games. Tech Moron was out of the picture for few months now. Tech Senior had some programming knowledge and was able to use my scripting language, but had very little understanding about the insides of the complex engine I wrote, which was now being developed for over a year. I had results, I was important, and I had demands. I scheduled meeting with the owner, where I wanted to present the list of all the wrong things and what I want to do about it. It all came to a single argument. I'm not happy here, but you need me, so you will fix these issues and give me a raise, or I'm leaving. And I will stand my ground. Recruiter from a big IT company I wanted to work for messaged me on LinkedIn few weeks prior, and I already went on the interview, so I had an escape plan prepared. The future looked bright, and I was ready to make it happen. The day of the meeting came up. I was in a good mood until there was a nasty accident in the workshop. I don't want to post any details, as this would identify me in a second, but this even is important. I, being the youngest one here, not even responsible for the mess, was tasked with cleaning it up. I had an argument with the workshop manager about me being a programmer and not a radioactive waste cleaning lady, but in the end, I just broke and started cleaning. Halfway through it, almost vomiting from the smell, I just snapped. None of this would happen in a decent IT company. I went to my office, packed my stuff, and just sat there just playing games, waiting for the owner. When he showed up, I told him about all the issues. He argued at some. But when we got to the end, I just told him that today was the last straw, and that I'm leaving right now. I was employed as an independent contractor, so they could save some money on taxes, and my contract had nothing about my time there. I just told him that I will send him download link for all the files I have, as the contract stated that they are owned by the company. He begged me to stay for one more month as they were behind on many deadlines. I just said I will think about it and left. On my way home, I called the recruiter and told him I accept the job and can start next month. Next day, I just made a big archive of about 150 GBs of files, backups, etc. that I had, uploaded it to my server, and emailed the link to the owner and Tech Senior. I then spent the next 2 weeks in bed, watching Netflix and ignoring calls. For the last week, I showed up to help clear up some things, hand over my projects, asked about the computers and other stuff I lent them, he told they will pay for it, and then left. I was lucky as hell. The next month, the corona happened, and month later, they were forced to close all games by government, making their income go almost zero overnight. This, I believe, was the reason they never paid me for my stuff. Even I repeatedly asked until I got tired of it. Time went by until a few weeks ago when I saw the Tech Senior was looking for a new job. I messaged him and we talked. He told me that they survived by doing private events for companies until they could open again a month ago. All the other tech guys except him were let go, but he managed. Until he got into an argument with the owner. He did not tell me much details, be the owner wanted something either impossible or expensive as f. When he presented cheap alternative, the owner just snapped and fired him on the spot. He tried to reason with him about not firing him until he can teach his successor and find a new job in the meantime, but he was fired on spot. Week later, I got a call from the owner. He hired the younger tech guys he fired during COVID and wanted me to come and answer their questions, mostly about the engine I wrote. I agreed, but as we were planning the meeting, I was suspecting he just wants me to do it for free. When I brought up the hourly rate, he just told me we will solve that later, hang up and never called again. The day of the meeting came. I was waiting in my car outside the workshop, waiting if he will call where am I, but he did not. Few days later, I parked next to warehouse where all the games were held, with a Yagi antenna in my car. Surprise, the Wi-Fi routers I lent them were still there, with the password unchanged. I connected to the Wi-Fi and poked around the network. All the PCs that I lent them to run the software on were still there, still running the Linux server I installed there, and looking at the logs, they were still used to control the games. I wrote a script that runs on boot, rolls a dice, and then deleted the whole drive. I was connected to my Wi-Fi router, making changes to my computer, formatting my drives. Then I drove away. Few days ago, I got a call. Apparently, when the Monday shift came in, the control system for one of the game was not responding. The browser was showing timeout. They decided to reset power for the whole rack, where all the PCs were multiple times, hoping it would start up, because turning it off and on again always works. When they decided to stop trying, they find out that all 8 games were dead. The new old tech guys figured out that the drives probably died, but had no knowledge about my system. so they could not set it up. When I asked about 𝐒𝐃𝐃𝐄𝐒, the owner made some excuse about him quitting and not wanting to work for them anymore. I told him I was happy to help. In the end, this used to be my dream job. But I now work for a big company, I don't have much time, and it's expensive. I can come over to set it up, but my hourly rate now is $150. He talked me down to $100, which was still about twice as much as I make now. When I arrived, I checked the PCs, pulled out the email I sent him a year ago, and told him that these serial numbers match these on the labels, and told him I'm happy to find my lost stuff, took first PC, and took it to my car. We had an argument. I told him that I'm either taking all that stuff, or he is paying me something over $2,400. He wanted to call police, but I had the proof this equipment was mine. He eventually agreed and I got to work. All my software was still in the bit bucket, even with the few modifications 𝐒𝐃𝐃𝐄𝐒 managed to make, alongside with all the config file and scripts with the game workflow that 𝐒𝐃𝐃𝐃𝐄𝐒 was periodically modifying and backing up. So it was pretty easy job. I got it all working, and then stayed for a few more hours, explaining some stuff to the tech guys. I printed the invoice and left, tired but satisfied. Yesterday, a nice sum of about $3,600 landed in my bank account. From what they told me, all 8 games were dead for 3 days. Each game costs between $80 and $120, takes 1 hour to finish, and half an hour is needed for preparation. So there are 12 slots every day, averaging on $9,600 income per day when fully booked. This is of course just the income, profit after paying all the rent, wages, electricity, consumables used in games, etc. is much lower, but I don't know how much. Before Corona, about 80% of slots was booked during week and 100% during weekends. I just like to think I made him lost $23,000, not counting the angry customers which were forced to reschedule, dollars just because he was a jerk. If he paid me for my stuff or did not fire his only tech guy, none of this would have happened. TL, DR. My boss was a jerk, made us work insane overtime, and did not pay me for equipment I agreed to sell to him, then fired everybody who knew how his business was running. I then decided to take over my equipment he stole, halting his business and costing him thousands. The revenge was really brutal. The owner's mismanagement and disregards for OP's concerns backfired, leading to crumbling down of his business empire. Had the company's owner paid what he owed to OP, he would have not faced such grave consequences, and he would have not lost such a large sum of money. The revenge was beyond perfect and deeply satisfying. The lesson we learn from the story is never mess with employees. Let's now jump on to the next story from Seagull Fan Club. I ruined my ex-boyfriend's life 20 plus years ago, and I just made sure it stayed ruined. When I was in college in the 90s, I met Jake, then 23, through mutual friends. He had already graduated and was planning to move to the opposite side of the United States for graduate school, and I had already been making plans to move with friends, only a 90-minute drive away from where he was moving to. We had so much in common, fell in love, and it really seemed like fate. Both planning to move 3,000 miles and landing so close together. He had 2 sisters and a younger brother who were all awesome people, and I became instant friends with them as well. Because he was in school and I was working, I would usually go to him to hang out on weekends. He was renting a house with 2 roommates, also in his program. We were young, so money was tight, but we had fun, went on taco dates, and spent a lot of time at his house, where he was breeding and selling small animals. Jake was an animal sciences PhD student, so being around animals was normal, and I loved it. I met and became friends with his advisor's wife, Mary, mid-50s, who worked in administration at the university. She is a lovely woman, and I would often have lunch with her when I went over on weekends. Jake was a teaching assistant, TA, and I met other people in the program and made friends with them faster than he did. After about 2 years of dating, I was at the house one day, lying in bed together, in a state of some undress, and he said out of the blue, he was concerned I'd been gaining weight, and it made it harder for him to be attracted to me. There was no concern about my health. It was all about him finding me unattractive. I sat up and said, well, then maybe you should make sure there is better food for me to eat than crackers and cheese when I come up on weekends. Even at 23, I didn't take that kind of BS. I had gained maybe 10 pounds since meeting him 2 years earlier and still wore the same size clothes, about a US size 6 to 8. I wasn't going to engage in a fight about it after all. It was his problem, not mine. So I asked him calmly, "So, what is your solution to this?" He stared at me blankly and said, "Well, I guess that you should try to lose weight." And I said, "Nah, I'm not going to do that. So what are you going to do about it?" He said, "Well, I guess nothing. I wanted to let you know how I feel." And I said, "Cool, thank you." I put my clothes back on, went to sleep, and drove home the next day as usual. We keep dating, and about 3 months later, he called me and said he wanted to break up after close to 3 years. The reason, and I quote, "You don't know enough about science." He felt like he couldn't have a conversation with me about his work because he didn't have to use common names for animals instead of scientific ones. I said, "Well, that's rubbish. What's the real reason?" He said it was the real reason. He came to see me a month later to return something of mine, and I confronted him, demanding the real reason. He finally admitted he had been seeing one of his undergrad students, let's call her Meg, a 19-year-old. He was then 26 and her teacher. I screamed at him to leave. My roommate threatened to throw him off our second-floor balcony if he didn't go, and he left. It hit me all at once after he walked out, and I went from rage to stunned laughter. I'd met Meg a few times, and at one point, she was at his house for a BBQ and spilt something all over her pants. Jake asked me if I could loan her some sweats. I couldn't because I was a size 8, and she was a size 18. Nothing wrong with that, at all. But the point is, I realized he made those comments about my weight to try and get me to break up with him because he was a coward. He clearly liked a big gal. Although, when he'd said those things to me about my weight, it was 1 a.m. I lived about 95 miles away, and we had just had sex, so I don't know how he thought this would go. Even in hindsight, it perplexes me. Did he think I was going to break up with him, storm off into the night, and drive for an hour and a half? Anyway, I emailed his roommates. It was the early 2000s. It's how you communicated anything you didn't want to say on the phone. I wanted to let them know we'd broken up, and that they were always lovely to me, and thanked them for being friends. They both admitted they knew about Meg, and were the ones to demand that Jake tell me, or they would. That's when he broke up with me with the lame you don't understand science excuse. One of his roommates, a super nice, super cute guy named George, offered to help me get a few things still at their house that he had collected for me away from around the house. He suggested I come up for the weekend. We go out and drink and have a good time. All the things Jake didn't want to waste money on, and I said sure. So I went up, and George let me into the house while Jake was gone. I took photos of all of his animals because while I might not be a PhD student, I paid attention and I knew he had an endangered species in his care. He wasn't breeding it. It was an unreleasable animal he had taken in from a rescue organization. There was paperwork he had to submit with a $25 fee, and he refused to do it, saying he didn't want the government in his business. I took photos of that animal, all his breeding conditions, and a photo of an animal not allowed in the state, which was in a tank right next to a window and visible from outside. I then went out for a night on the town with George. We stumbled in early, around midnight, so Jake and Meg, who were watching TV, would see me in a short dress, drunk, and George practically carrying me. I spent the night in George's room. He was a total gentleman, but made sure to leave the room and parade past them in his boxers a few times, and we giggled and moaned loudly so they could hear us. When I went to leave the next morning, Jake said I didn't have to act like a whore in front of him, as I ate a donut slowly in my rumpled dress with messy hair, while George beamed at me and then planted a kiss on my head. Meg looked ashamed, not quite knowing where to look, and I said, "Have fun with my leftovers," and walked out. I wanted to think the petty, loud hookup and a few juvenile insults were my revenge. It was not. The next day, I had my photos developed, the good old days, and called the State Office of Fish and Wildlife. I reported the animals in the house, the potential overcrowding of breeding animals, and the 2 animals he shouldn't legally have at all in the state, and asked them how to make a report. Turns out Jake wasn't well liked by his peers in his program or by his roommates, but I was. George had suggested that he and their other roommate could submit complaints to the university that a TA was sleeping with one of his students and showing her favoritism. The night we were out at the bars, we made sure to tell the story to anyone who they knew. They made sure all the women in his classes knew he was sleeping with Meg. It wasn't a large program, so people knew fast he had cheated and was now dating his student. George and the other roommate made sure people knew they had put in complaints, sick of Jake's entitled BS. With my full statement made and photos sent to the state wildlife officials, I called my friend Mary, Jake's advisor's wife. She knew about the breakup and lame reason, and I let her know he admitted he was sleeping with a student. I'd been emailing with him, and he admitted to it in writing, so I sent that to Mary. To say she was not happy about that was an understatement. She said she made sure it would be investigated and told her husband, Jake's direct advisor, while I was on the phone with her. Speaking of investigations, a few weeks later, George called me, giddy, to say state fish and wildlife officials were there, confiscating animals. He told them he would be happy to tell them whatever they needed to know. Meg was there when it happened and told the officials that, as far as she knew, all the animals belonged to her boyfriend Jake and that they were all legal. That put George and the other roommate in the clear. One animal was kept in the backyard, so it was implied to Jake that a neighbor reported it. While they were there to investigate, they knew to look in the back window to see the far more problematic, illegal to have in the state, under nearly any circumstances, animal. Since George was on the lease, he was able to let them in to investigate in the house. The animals were all in communal areas, and the officers stayed there for a few hours, and returned with a warrant to take all the animals and enter Jake's room to investigate. George and the other roommate let them into their rooms with no issues and were quickly cleared. Meg apparently couldn't get a hold of Jake and eventually drove to the university to find him. Remember, no cell phones yet. It was a good day. The only animals they left were some guppies in a fish tank. Now, PhD students need grant money to do research, and a large part of animal studies funding comes from the federal government. Jake had just gotten an EPA grant right around when he broke up with me. So I called the EPA and asked how I would report that a person with a federal grant was being investigated for illegally harboring endangered animals. Long story short, he lost his EPA grant and had to make restitution on what had already been used, close to $30,000. He would never be able to get another federal grant. He avoided jail time on the state charges, since all the animals were in good health, but lost all his breeding animals, worth thousands of dollars, since they were collected for safekeeping during the investigation when the 2 illegal animals were taken. In the end, he owed a $15,000 fine, and the 2 animals went to a nearby nature center. For years, I would stop by if I was in the area to visit them. The university revoked his scholarship and fired him from teaching for having an inappropriate relationship with a student. He somehow escaped being expelled, but it always shocked me that he never tried to hide the relationship with Meg and was so stupidly self-assured. He didn't even wait the 4 weeks until she would have been done with his class to start publicly dating her. By the university rules, he would have been in the clear to date her, not being her teacher anymore, and she would just have to avoid any classes he was a TA in. It never fails to make me laugh. After a few months, I emailed his sisters and told them I missed them, because Jake broke up with me after trying to call me fat and cheating on me, and I felt weird contacting them. The girls told me he told the family I broke up with him because of the distance. I forwarded them emails that Jake wrote after the breakup, talking about how he fell for Meg, and he was sorry about it, but it was true. I couldn't keep up with him academically, and it made him attracted to Meg. Jake managed to convince his dad to pay for 1 more year of school so he could get a master's instead of a PhD. And while I stayed in contact with his sisters and brother via email and then social media, I largely let it all go. I got even, made some friends. Mary became like an auntie to me, and I went on with life. I went on to get a master's degree myself. What was my specialty? Helping scientists and doctors communicate their work to lay people. You know, us dummies who can't remember all the scientific names. I swear, it happened by accident, not design, but I love it. And I work with everyone from small-town doctors and nurses to pharmaceutical companies to museums to state and federal governments to film and TV producers. I travel a lot and speak and get to learn a lot of cool things about our planet and how things work. I knew through his siblings that Jake and Meg got married and had 2 kids. Meg dropped out of the sciences and became an accountant. Jake went back to breeding animals. Every once in a while, His sisters or brother would tell me something over for lunch or via text, but we had our own relationship that exists outside of him. Apparently, when I sent a wedding gift for one of his sisters, he loudly complained at a co-ed bridal shower that all of his siblings still were my friends, and didn't make an effort to embrace his now wife Meg. Apparently, the sister just laughed and said, "I don't make it a habit to be friends with homewreckers." This is how Jake's parents found out how their relationship started and ours ended, 10 years after we broke up. Jake never found out I was behind reporting him to the state, and in the end, I didn't lie about a single thing. Except maybe exaggerating a drunken makeout session with George, who is now a successful and tenured professor with a lovely wife and daughters. Fast forward about 20 years to a few weeks ago. I was at a university giving a lecture to a room of 250 undergrad and graduate students. In the end, I was mingling with the student afterwards, and I hear a voice say, "Hey OP, long time no see." And I realize it's Jake, and I didn't change the expression on my face at all. I was completely shocked, and my instinct was to play dumb. So I said, "I'm sorry, help me out. Have we met at another workshop or lecture?" He looked incredulous and said, "It's me, Jake." And I said, "I can't place you, but I would love to figure it out." Finally, I gasped and said, "Oh my goodness, Jake. I guess I blocked you out," and said, "Well, lovely to see you," and moved on quickly when he tried to reach out and hug me. I was happy to leave it there, with the satisfaction of him seeing me as a guest lecturer in the science department of a major university when he was just in the audience. The department chair and faculty who had invited me to speak took me out to dinner, and while there, one of them said, "So, you know Jake?" I said, "I did it over 20 years ago," being vague about how. She went on to tell me he had been there for an interview for a teaching position and had spent a few days there observing, and they were likely going to hire him. I couldn't control it. I scoffed. When they all looked at me, I said, "I'm sorry, I'm just shocked he's teaching after what happened at University X." They said what happened, and I said he was sleeping with a 19-year-old student when he was 26, and he had to leave the program without a PhD because he couldn't afford to stay after losing his scholarship. The 3 people I was with all looked at each other like they knew they had a problem and said, "Wow, we'll have to look into that and change the subject." My old friend Mary, retired a year or 2 now, but still friendly with her old colleagues, called me this weekend to say a friend at the university let her know someone had called doing a background check about Jake, and they pulled his file, which included being fired, leaving the program with a lower degree, and the complaint letters from over 20 years ago about his conduct. Mary's name had been on it with her husband listed as the faculty advisor, so she thought she'd like to know. As a bonus, it had a copy of his arrest record for the illegal animals. I guess his dad paid for a decent lawyer to get the record expunged after the charges were reduced, and he paid the fines, so it doesn't show up on a standard background check. I don't think he's going to get that job. So I will return to my life, content that the universe comes through sometimes, especially if you give it a little nudge now and then. The best revenge is when you don't have to do anything wrong. You just have to help direct knowledge to the right places. If there is anything I can impart to any young women and men reading this, as I shimmy happily into my now size 10 pants, it's that if someone who is supposed to love you complains about your weight or looks, that is their problem to fix mentally, not yours. And maybe it's time to check out what they are doing behind your back or simply move on. Remember though, it is their flaw, not yours. If Jake hadn't been a coward and tried to make me break up with him, and just ended things with me in a mature way, I might not have found out about Meg and turned his own wickedness back on himself. The revenge was brilliantly orchestrated and brutally executed that shattered OP's ex-boyfriend's reputation and academic career. OP's ex-boyfriend's own actions, inappropriate relationship with his student, and his illegal harboring of endangered animals precipitated to destroy him. OP did nothing. She just reported. The final blow came when OP's engulfed his prospects of job after 20 years of their breakup. The revenge brutal, cool, and deeply satisfying. The revenge was brilliantly orchestrated and brutally executed, shattering OP's ex-boyfriend's reputation and academic career. OP's ex-boyfriend's own actions, an inappropriate relationship with his student, and illegal harboring of endangered animals led to his downfall. OP did nothing. She just reported the incidents. The final blow came after 20 years when OP engulfed his ex's prospects of a job. The revenge was brutal, cool, and deeply satisfying. What do the Mac Reddit fans think? Is the OP an AH or not? Let me know in the comment section below. If you like the stories I brought you, just hit the like button, share them as much as you can, and don't forget to subscribe to Mac Reddit for a daily dose. Bye bye, see you tomorrow with some more spicy fries!